Hello. Today we're going to talk about informative speeches. I'm going to give you the requirements and I'm also going to give you some tips on giving your own informative speech. So your informative speech, of course, should be informative and we'll explain that in a little bit. About 4 to 7 minutes long. It should have sources, at least 3 sources, and you're going to want to cite them in your speech. Use slides. You could use PowerPoint. You can use Prezi. You can use slides. Any slide program is fine. You must have an outline with the reference page included in that outline, and that's submitted before you submit the speech. Okay, the parts of the speech. Now, we've talked about this before. The parts of the speech don't change. You have the introduction, you have the body, you have the conclusion. And the introduction, a lot of what we talked about before is the same. You want to have some kind of attention-grabbing device. Statistics work really well in this kind of speech, but it could be anything: questions, quotes, interesting facts. You also want to preview the points, what we are going to see. So first I'm going to talk about this, then I am going to explain this, and then I am going to do that. Um, Also, in this kind of speech, a lot of times people like to give the reasons why we should believe them. In other words, give your credentials. So you could say, having worked as a computer repair person, I know firsthand the damages that this can do to your computer, something like that. You give your credentials, make yourself a little more believable. The body is self-explanatory, and the conclusion. In the conclusion, you want to repeat the main points. Um, Also, you might want to talk about why this information is helpful, how this information will help this person. Next time you are in the situation where ... you might be able to use this information. Um, just be careful not to make this into a persuasive speech at this point. So in other words, don't say, this is what you should be doing, or this is what I want you to do after having heard this speech. That's more of a persuasive speech. In this speech, you're just giving information and they can decide what to do or what not to do. Let's talk a little bit more about giving credibility. We talked about how you might want to talk about your credibility, but you also want to give sources. List sources which will aid in giving the credibility. When you're doing this, even in a speech, you want to tell where that information came from. So give the person's name. You don't have to give the year in a speech. In a paper you would, but in a speech you do not. So here are 2 different examples, and you want to make it as strong as possible. So the first example is something like Steven Pinker states that as children, our minds are a blank slate. That's fine, but probably no one knows who Steven Pinker is. So the better way of doing it is Steven Pinker, renowned psychologist, claims that, and then give the information. Same thing with websites and same thing with journals. If you can say why this is important. So ABC site, a common site for investigating whatever. So now we have a better idea of why that source is important. Also, make sure the sources are trustworthy. So you don't want to talk about um, the lies about the problems with tobacco, and then you find out it comes from a cigarette company or something like that. You want to make sure your sources are trustworthy. In fact, in this speech, one of your sources should not be a website. One of your sources should be an article, um, or a newspaper article or something like that. Okay, types of informative speeches. There are a few different kinds of informative speeches you could give. And all of these examples are good for a business setting informative speech. So the first one is objects. They explain people, places, or things. So, for example, you could talk about The Real Wolf of Wall Street. So, The Wolf of Wall Street was a movie, but it was based off of a real person. You could tell us about that person, who he is and what he did. Um, a little more dry would be corporate loans for minorities. Explain how minorities could get corporate loans, or corporate loans for women. How women could get corporate loans. There are also process speeches. So these are often how-to speeches, or how something happens. So, for example, how to handle a difficult customer, how to talk to a difficult customer. That would be a how-to process speech. How to write a business proposal. Also a process speech. You could also talk about events, so famous events related to business, of course. So the stock market crash of 1929, or even the stock market crash of 2008, would be a great example of a business-related event. Concept speeches are a little more abstract. So, for example, types of insurance or types of sub-insurance. Um, Another example, selling short in the stock market. Once again, very abstract, a little more difficult, I would say. Okay, and finally, some more tips for your informative speech. So it's always best to speak to what you know. So if you are well informed about a certain topic, that's probably going to come through in your speech. Now, you don't have to. You can pick something you are passionate about, even if you don't know a lot about it, but do your research then ahead of time. Be specific. So when I'm saying be specific, so a lot of topics can be very broad. So for example, before we had selling short in the stock market. That's a little more specific. Um, much more broad topic would be investing in the stock market. Now that might be too big of a topic to talk about in 4 to 7 minutes. In fact, I've had students try that before and they've gone way over 10, 15 minutes. Um, Also, once again, we talked about this before, but it's good to say again, be careful not to shift into a persuasive speech. So at the very end, people often give us should statements. Should statements are often persuasive speeches, and you want to stay away from that. Um, Also, in your slides, your last slide, you should include a list of your sources. Now, I have a video made on how to include a list of sources in your PowerPoint slides and how to format it so it looks like a list of sources if you need to look at that. But keep that information in your last slide as well. Now, inside of your other slides, you might want to put citations as well. That's fine. Um, Definitely include it in the speech as you're saying it. But as your last slide, it's always a good idea for the people who are watching to give all the sources in case I want to go and look up those sources myself later on.